The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, everyone in the room laughed. Not polite laughter. Not the embarrassed kind people cover with their hands. This was the full, ugly sound of people who have been waiting to see someone fall and have finally gotten their wish. The four older girls crowded in the doorway of Mrs. Vale's office parlor, and one of them actually slapped the doorframe. She was laughing so hard. The two trustees seated along the wall exchanged that tight adult smile that pretends to be sympathetic, but is really just cruelty wearing better clothes. Even the lawyer from Union looked down at his papers like he was embarrassed to be reading the words aloud. Mrs. Hester Vale stood nearest the stove, because warmth in the Monroe Female Relief House belonged to rank. Her steel gray bun was pulled so tight it seemed to drag all the mercy off her face. When the laughter died down enough for her to speak, she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Miss Wren, your grandfather has left you a box of wind and a house built against a grave." I was 16 years old. I had been at the relief house since I was 11, when pneumonia took my mother one winter after a timber chain crushed my father in a slide above Gap Mills. Before that, I'd been passed around like a piece of furniture that nobody quite wanted, but nobody could throw away. 3 months with Uncle Vernon Wren, who drank and sold my mother's quilt for whiskey money. 7 months with the Bickles, who needed hands for milking and sent me away when they caught me reading by lantern after dark. 4 months with the Cutlips, who returned me to the relief house because I argued that a leaking roof needed patching before prayer. I had $1.32 to my name. I owned 1 spoon, 2 dresses, a tin of needles, and 3 books with their covers torn off that I had stolen from donation bins over the years. Mrs. Vale called my reading vanity. She called my questions impertinence. She called my habit of noticing things a defect of character that no decent household would tolerate. And now my grandfather, a man I had never met, who had died 2 years earlier in a hollow 3 miles from nowhere, had left me his entire estate. 12 acres of rocky slope pressed against a limestone bluff, a cabin that everyone said was falling down, and a cave. A hole in the cliff face that local children called the White Lung, because it breathed fog in summer and seemed to exhale in winter like something alive. The whole place was known in Mercy Crossing as Wren's Folly, because my grandfather had spent 30 years measuring that cave's breadth instead of raising proper crops like a sensible man. He had bought the tract in 1867 for $9. The auctioneer had laughed then, too. $9 for a place that couldn't be farmed, couldn't be timbered, couldn't be anything but a slow way to starve. 12 acres of nothing and a reputation for madness that had followed my grandfather to his grave. The trustees were already standing to leave. The girls in the doorway were whispering to each other, delighted by this final proof that I would never amount to anything. Mrs. Vale was watching me with that thin satisfaction she always wore when the world confirmed her lowest expectations. But something was happening inside me that I couldn't explain. When the lawyer mentioned the cave, when he said the words "breathes in weather," something fired in my chest. Not hope exactly. Something older than hope. Something that felt like recognition, though I had never seen the place and couldn't have explained what I was recognizing. It felt like a door had opened in a room I didn't know I was standing in. I wanted to see a place that kept its own weather. I wanted to know why a man would spend 30 years measuring the breadth of a mountain. If you want to find out what I did with that sealed cave in the mountains of West Virginia, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a carpetbag of stolen books turned a hole in a cliff into something that saved an entire valley from the worst winter anyone had ever seen, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I built against that bluff, what I learned from a dead man's hidden journals, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left 4 days later. Mrs. Vale didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to be rid of one more mouth, one more girl who asked too many questions. I carried everything I owned in a single carpetbag. The wagon driver took me as far as the fork south of Union, then stopped his mules and pointed down a rutted track that disappeared into laurel and shadow. "Mercy Gap's 3 miles that way," he said. "Road gets worse before it ends." I climbed down with my carpetbag. The driver looked at me the way people look at a dog that's been left on the side of a road. He didn't offer to take me farther. He didn't wish me well. He just clicked his tongue at the mules and left me standing in the mud. The road did get worse. Within a quarter mile, it narrowed from wagon ruts to a single rocky track, the kind made by feet and hooves rather than wheels. The trees closed in. Tulip poplars and white oaks gave way to hemlock and rhododendron, the kind of growth that means poor soil and steep ground. I could hear water somewhere below me, trickling through limestone, but I couldn't see it. The hollow swallowed sound the way a mouth swallows food. I walked for 2 hours. My carpetbag handle dug into my palm until I switched hands, then dug into that palm too. The light was failing by the time I saw the bluff. It rose out of the hollow like a wall, pale gray limestone stained with rust where iron had leached through, topped with a fringe of scrub pine and laurel. The rock face was maybe 60 feet high, not massive by mountain standards, but in that narrow hollow, it felt like something that had been placed there deliberately, something that was watching. The cabin crouched at the base of the bluff like an animal that had given up. I stood in the yard and looked at it, and the looking took something out of me. The porch sagged away from the front wall at an angle that hurt to see. One shutter hung by a single strap hinge. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown off and nobody had replaced them. The chimney leaned. The whole structure had the posture of a thing that had been waiting a long time to fall down and was surprised to still be standing. The yard was all nettles and shale flakes. Someone had stacked firewood against the cabin wall years ago, and the wood had gone silver with age and begun to collapse into itself. Mouse droppings darkened the doorstep. The smell was mineral damp and old ash and something else underneath, something cold and clean that I couldn't name yet. I pushed open the door. The hinges screamed. Inside was worse than outside. A single room, maybe 15 feet by 12, an iron bedstead with a straw tick mattress that mice had colonized, a table with one leg shorter than the others, a stove with a cracked plate that would leak smoke, a wool blanket folded with absurd neatness on the bed, as if someone had believed that neatness could hold back the ruin of everything else. Silas had died orderly. That made it sadder. I set my carpetbag on the table and stood there in the fading light, listening to the cabin creak in the wind. Outside, through the gaps in the walls, I could see the bluff. And at the base of the bluff, half hidden by laurel and wind-thrown stone, I could see a darker shadow, a hole in the rock, a mouth, the cave. I'd come 3 miles down a road that ended at nothing to inherit a cabin that was falling down, 12 acres that couldn't be plowed, and a hole in a cliff that local children called the White Lung because it breathed fog in summer. I was 16 years old. I had $1.32. I had no family anywhere in the world who would claim me. I sat down on the bed, and the ropes creaked under my weight, and I did not cry. I'd stopped crying the year my mother died. Crying requires the belief that someone might hear you. I had lost that belief a long time ago, but I did not sleep that night. I lay on the mouse-eaten mattress and listened to the wind come through the walls and thought about Mrs. Vale's face when she read the will. A box of wind and a house built against a grave. She had been so certain that Silas Wren's inheritance was a final cruelty, a joke played on me by a dead man I had never met. And lying there in the dark, listening to the cabin groan, I thought she might be right. The next morning I tried to make the place livable. I stuffed rags into the gaps in the walls. I swept out the mouse droppings with a bundle of hemlock branches. I found a tin bucket with only one hole in it and walked a quarter mile to a spring that ran thin and cold from between 2 rocks. The water tasted of iron and limestone. The stove worked, barely. Smoke leaked from the cracked plate, but if I kept the fire small and the damper open, I could cook without choking. I had brought a small sack of cornmeal from the Relief House stores, taken without asking because Mrs. Vale had never given me anything I didn't take for myself. I mixed it with spring water and cooked it into mush on the cracked stove and ate it with my 1 spoon. It was not enough. It would not be enough for long, but as I ate, I noticed something. One of the floorboards near the bed sounded different. I'd stepped on it that morning and heard a hollow thunk instead of a solid creak. Now, with nothing else to do but survive, I got down on my knees and looked at it. The board was loose, not rotted loose, but deliberately loose. Someone had pried it up and set it back without nailing it. I worked my fingers under the edge and lifted. Underneath was a cavity in the joists, lined with oilcloth. And inside the oilcloth was a package wrapped so carefully that it might have been a body. I lifted it out. My hands were shaking. I don't know why. Something about the care of it, the deliberate hiding, the sense that someone had put this here for a reason and then died before they could explain what the reason was. I unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 14 ledger books, each about the size of a hymnal, each numbered on the spine in lampblack. 1 through 14. Some of them had swelled with damp. Others were still tight and dry. Underneath the books were 2 thermometers in wooden cases, a brass compass with a cracked face, and a tin of carpenter's pencils sharpened to points. I picked up the first ledger. The spine said 1 in faded black ink. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and cramped but readable. It said, October 12th, 1867. Arrived at Mercy Gap. Purchased the tract at auction for $9. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. He said I had bought exactly $9 worth of nothing. I do not think he is wrong. But there is a cave here, and I have questions about caves. I sat on the floor of the cabin with the book in my hands and read until the light failed. Silas Boone Wren had been my grandfather, my mother's father. I had never met him because he lived in a hollow 3 miles from nowhere, and my mother had married a timberman and moved to Gap Mills and then died before she could ever bring me back. I learned this from the journals. I learned everything from the journals. He had been a school teacher once, in the valley, before the war. He had fought in the war and come back with something broken in him that made him want silence more than company. He had bought the Mercy Gap tract because it was cheap and far away from other people, and because he had read something about caves that had made him curious. The first 5 journals were observations, 31 years of observations. He had measured the temperature inside the cave every morning and every evening, at the mouth and at 50 feet and at 100 feet. He had recorded the outside temperature at the same times. He had noted the wind direction, the humidity, the phase of the moon. He had burned smoke pots at the cave mouth and watched which way the smoke went, and he had discovered something that nobody else in Monroe County knew. In summer, cool air flowed out of the cave during the day because the deep rock stayed cooler than the outside air. In winter, warmer air flowed out at night because the deep rock stayed warmer than the outside air. The cave breathed, it really breathed, just like the children said. But it wasn't breathing because it was alive. It was breathing because of physics. I didn't know the word physics then. Silas didn't use it either. He wrote about the mountain's steadiness and the stone's memory of other seasons. But what he meant was that deep in the limestone, past the first chamber and into the passages beyond, the rock held a temperature close to the yearly average. Summer didn't heat it much. Winter didn't cool it much. It just stayed. 52, 53, 54 degrees. Year after year after year. And Silas had wondered, what if you could borrow that steadiness? Journals 6 through 9 were maps, hand-drawn cross-sections of the cave with arrows showing airflow and numbers showing temperatures at different depths. Smoke test results, diagrams of how the cave connected to the outside through cracks he had found in the bluff face. Journals 10 through 12 were construction plans. Silas had designed something he called a winter throat, an enclosed passage from the cabin to the cave mouth, sealed tight, with doors at both ends and a baffle vent in between. The idea was simple but strange. Instead of trying to heat the cabin with fire alone, he wanted to connect the cabin's air to the cave's air. Let the mountain's steadiness buffer the cabin against the killing cold of February. Let the stone do some of the work that wood and fire usually did alone. He had started building it. Journal 12 had sketches of stone footings laid at the cave mouth, measurements for lumber, notes about which boards from the porch would be the right length. He had been dismantling his own porch to build the corridor. And then he had died. Journal 13 was a winter log from 1894, the last full winter he had lived through. Journal 14 was personal. Letters never sent. Notes to my mother, Ruth, who had left the hollow and married and died before she could ever come back. Notes to me. I found the note to me on the third night, reading by the light of a tallow stub that was burning down too fast. To the child who still asks why, it said at the top, I do not know if you will ever come here. I do not know if you will ever read this, but if you do, I want you to know that I was not crazy. I was just patient. The mountain keeps its own time. Learn how to ask it, and it will answer. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. I sat on the floor of the cabin with that page in my hands, and I cried, not from sadness, from the shock of recognition. Someone like me had come before, someone who noticed systems and remembered numbers and trusted observation more than other people's certainty. Someone who had looked at this worthless place and seen a question worth 31 years of his life. Silas had seen something in this hollow. He had worked for 3 decades to prove it, and he had died in the doorway carrying planks for a corridor he never finished, and everyone in Mercy Crossing had nodded and said they always knew he was crazy. I was not going to let them be right. The next day I walked the 3 miles into Mercy Crossing to buy supplies. Mercy Crossing was barely a town, a church, a mercantile with a post office in the back, a blacksmith shop, a small wool warehouse, and maybe 40 houses scattered along the creek. 200 and some people who all knew each other and all knew exactly who I was before I opened my mouth. The mercantile was run by a man named Pell and his wife Martha. She stood behind the counter when I came in, a woman with a face like a hatchet and a voice like a church bell that had cracked. "You're the Wren girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "The one who inherited Silas's place." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at me the way you look at a stray cat that has wandered into your barn, not with cruelty exactly, just with the certain knowledge that nothing good will come of it. "Folks say that cave breathes," she said. "Cold in summer, warm in winter, ungodly either way." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. "Your granddaddy spent 30 years measuring that breath," she continued. 30 years carrying smoke pots into that hole, 30 years talking about heating a house with stone instead of fire. She shook her head. "People thought he was touched. I thought he was touched. You planning to live off that hole in the cliff, girl?" "I'm planning to live," I said. "Not in that place, you aren't." I bought cornmeal and salt on credit. Martha Pell wrote my name in a ledger and told me the debt would come due in spring. I walked the 3 miles back to the cabin with the supplies in my carpet bag and the weight of her certainty on my shoulders. Everyone in Mercy Crossing knew that Silas Wren had been crazy. Everyone knew that his land was worthless. Everyone knew that a 16-year-old orphan girl with no family and no skills and no money was not going to survive a winter in a cabin that was falling down at the base of a cliff. I knew it too. That was the worst part. I knew they were probably right. But I had the journals, and I had nothing to lose. The first 2 weeks in that cabin nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. The cornmeal ran out faster than I expected because I was burning more fuel than I had, and burning fuel made me hungry, and being hungry made me burn more fuel. The spring ran thin in the cold, and I had to walk farther each day to find water that wasn't filmed with ice. The stove's cracked plate leaked smoke into the cabin until my throat was raw and my eyes streamed constantly. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. My dresses hung on me like sacks. My hands cracked and bled from the cold and the water and the constant work of hauling wood and cooking food and stuffing rags into gaps that the wind found anyway. I woke up at night shivering so hard my teeth hurt. One morning I walked halfway to the road. I stood there in the frozen mud, looking at the track that led back to Union, back to the relief house, back to Mrs. Vale's pinched face and the dormitory beds and the girls who had laughed when the lawyer read the will. I could go back. I could tell them the place was uninhabitable. I could admit that Silas Wren had left me nothing but a slow way to die. Mrs. Vale would take me in. She would have to. And she would spend the rest of my time there reminding me that she had been right, that the inheritance was a cruel joke, that I had been a fool to believe a box of wind could be anything but what it sounded like. I stood on that road for a long time. Then I walked back to the cabin. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of my mother, who had survived pneumonia for 2 winters before it finally took her, who had never complained even when she was too weak to stand. Maybe it was Silas's note, the child who still asks why. I was still asking, and I hadn't found the answer yet. That afternoon I reread Journal 12, the construction plans for the winter throat. Silas had laid stone footings at the cave mouth. He had measured the porch boards and found that 14 of them were the right length for the corridor walls. He had sketched a door frame and a baffle vent, and a ceiling system using lime mortar and linen strips. He had done everything except build it. I looked at the porch that was already falling down, the porch that was made of boards that were exactly the right length. I picked up the hammer that I'd found in the cabin's single cupboard. I walked outside. I stood on the sagging porch and looked at the boards under my feet. Then I started prying them up. The work was harder than anything I had ever done. I was 16 years old, and I weighed maybe 95 pounds after 2 weeks of not eating enough. I had never built anything more complicated than a corn husk doll. I didn't know how to use a froe or set a mortise or mix lime mortar. I had read about these things in Silas's journals, but reading about them was not the same as doing them, but I had no choice. That's the thing about having no choice. It simplifies your options considerably. I dismantled the porch over 3 days. The nails were rusted and many of them bent or broke when I tried to pull them, but I saved every one I could straighten. The boards were weathered, but mostly sound. I stacked them by length against the cabin wall, just like Silas had described. Then I walked to the cave mouth and looked at it. The entrance was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet high, narrowing as it went back into the dark. Silas's stone footings were still there, half buried in leaf litter and wind-blown soil. 2 courses of flat limestone carefully laid, forming the base for walls that had never been built. I cleared the footings. I measured the distance from the cave mouth to where the cabin's front door would be if I removed the porch entirely. 22 feet. Silas had estimated 20. I looked at the stack of boards. I counted them. 14 good boards, 12 feet long, 8 shorter pieces, some scraps. It wasn't enough lumber. I knew it wasn't enough lumber. But it was what I had. The forest had given me barely enough to survive those first weeks. Chickweed growing in the lee of the cabin wall. A rabbit I caught in a snare made from a bootlace. Acorns that I cracked and leached in the spring and ground into something that was almost flour. But the forest couldn't give me lumber. The forest couldn't give me the skill to build what Silas had designed. I started anyway. I set the first boards on the stone footings, bracing them with rocks. They fell over. I tried again. They fell over again. I sat in the leaf litter and looked at the boards and thought about going back to the road. "You're doing it wrong." The voice came from behind me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart slamming. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. Old. 70, at least. One eye clouded with cataract, the other bright and sharp. His hands were white in the creases, stained with something powdery. "Lime," he said, seeing me look. "I was a stonemason once." "Who are you?" "Jonah Beale." He walked toward me, not fast, but steady. He moved like a man whose body hurt, but who had learned to ignore it. "I live down the hollow about a mile. I've been watching your smoke." "Watching my smoke?" "Watching you tear down that porch and haul the boards over here." He stopped at the edge of the footings and looked down at them. "Silas's footings. He laid them in 92. I helped him with the lintel." He pointed at a flat stone set across the top of the cave mouth. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I could see it was shaped, deliberate, a frame for a door that had never been hung. "You knew my grandfather." "Played checkers with him on Sundays, when he'd come down from this hollow, which wasn't often." Jonah Beale looked at me with his one good eye. "He talked about you, the granddaughter he'd never met, the one Ruth had before she died." My throat closed up. I didn't know what to say. "He sent for you, you know. Sent a letter to that relief house after Ruth passed. Asked them to put you on a train." Jonah shook his head slowly. "I guess the letter never got there." I thought of Mrs. Vale, her steel gray bun, and her expression of permanent mild disgust. I thought of her saying, "A box of wind and a house built against a grave." "It got there," I said. "It just never got to me." Jonah looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the boards lying in the dirt, and the stone footings, and the cave mouth with its lintel waiting for a door. "You're trying to build his winter throat." "I don't know what I'm trying to do. I just know I'll die if I don't do something." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. "Your granddaddy wasn't trying to heat a whole house like a furnace," he said. "He was trying to borrow steadiness. Let the mountain do some of the work." He bent down slowly and picked up one of the boards. "You need frames first, vertical posts. Tie them together at the top, then nail the boards across horizontal." "I don't know how to do that." "I know." He straightened up, the board in his hands. "That's why I'm here." Jonah Beale became my teacher. He came every day for the first 2 weeks, walking the mile from his cabin in the early morning and leaving before dark. He brought his tools in a leather satchel, a square, a level, an auger, a froe, a mallet. He showed me how to split straight posts from poplar trunks, how to set them plumb using the level, how to frame a wall so it would stand against wind and snow. He never did the work for me. He showed me once, then watched while I tried. When I got it wrong, he told me why. When I got it right, he nodded and moved on to the next thing. "Your granddaddy could read about anything and understand it," he said one afternoon, watching me drive a peg into a mortise. "But he couldn't make his hands do what his head knew. That was his trouble. He understood the cave. He just couldn't build the thing that would let him use it." "But you could." "I could build, but I didn't understand." He smiled, or something close to it. Between the two of us, we had one complete person. We just never figured out how to share right. The frame went up over 2 weeks. 8 posts sunk into the stone footings, tied together with cross beams, braced against the bluff face on one side and freestanding on the other. It looked like a skeleton of something that might one day be a hallway. Then we started nailing the boards. This was where my ignorance showed worst. I didn't know how to seal joints. I didn't know how much gap was too much gap. I didn't know how to make a door that would actually close tight. Jonah knew all of it. "Lime mortar," he said. "Lime and sand and water. I've got a kiln shed with some quickite left over from last year. Mix it right and it'll seal any crack you can stuff it into." "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. We were sitting on the footings, resting. My shoulders burned. My hands were blistered in places that hadn't calloused yet. "I had a son," he said finally. "Good boy, strong, worked at the quarry up on Keeney Knob." He paused. "There was a blast. Charge went wrong, brought down half the face. My boy was under it." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. My wife went the next winter, fever. After that, I didn't much see the point of anything. He looked at the half-built corridor, the boards nailed to the frame, the gaps still waiting to be sealed. "Then I saw your smoke, saw you tearing down that porch, and I thought, that's Silas's grandgirl, trying to finish what he started, and Silas was my friend and he never got to finish anything." He stood up slowly, his joints cracking. "So I'm helping you finish, because somebody should." The first test failed. We had built the corridor 20 feet long, 5 feet wide, with double doors at each end. The boards were nailed tight. The gaps were stuffed with linen strips and clay and moss, then sealed with Jonah's lime mortar. It looked solid. It felt solid. But when the first real cold snap came in late November, I closed the cabin door and opened the corridor door and waited for the cave's breath to fill the passage. Instead, I heard whistling. One of the wall seams had opened. The mortar had cracked where we'd applied it too thick. Cold air was streaming through, not from the cave, but from outside, and the cross-draft was pulling smoke back from my stove and filling the cabin with it. I coughed until I couldn't breathe. I threw open the cabin door and stumbled out into the cold, and stood there with tears streaming down my face that weren't from crying. Jonah found me like that an hour later. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the cracked seam and the smoke-blackened cabin interior and nodded slowly. too thick, he said. Mortar cracked because it dried too fast. We'll have to strip it and do it again. Thinner layers. Give each one time to cure. It took us 3 more days. 3 days of chipping out mortar and resealing and waiting and chipping out more mortar and resealing again. 3 days when the cold deepened and my food ran lower and I thought about the road more than I should have. But on the 4th day, we finished. I woke before dawn. The cabin was cold, colder than it had been in weeks. I could see my breath in the dark. I got out of bed and walked to the wash basin, the same cracked basin that had been there when I arrived. The water was liquid. I stood there staring at it. Outside, through the gaps in the shutters, I could see frost on the ground, frost on the dead grass, frost on everything. But the water in my basin was not frozen. The water in my basin was cold, yes, but liquid, moving, alive. I walked to the corridor door. I could feel something different on that side of the cabin. Not warm exactly, but less cold. A presence of air that wasn't hostile. I opened the door. The corridor stretched away from me, dim in the pre-dawn light. At the far end, through the second door, I could see the black mouth of the cave. And flowing toward me, slow and steady, I could feel it. The mountain's breath. It wasn't warm, maybe 50 degrees, maybe 52. But compared to the air outside, compared to the killing cold that should have been seeping through my walls, it felt like something close to mercy. It felt like someone had left a door open to a gentler season. I walked into the corridor. The air wrapped around me. I put my hand on the wall and felt the stone footings beneath the boards, felt the mass of the bluff behind them, felt the weight of all that rock that had been holding this temperature since before I was born, since before my mother was born, since before Silas first measured it with his homemade thermometer and wrote the numbers down in a ledger that nobody believed. I sat down on the corridor floor. I put my face in my hands. And I laughed once. And then I cried. And then I just sat there feeling the cave's breath move past me like a river of air that had been waiting all this time for someone to open the door. When Jonah arrived that morning, I was still sitting there. He stood in the corridor doorway and looked at me, and then he looked at the thermometer he'd hung on the wall, and then he smiled. 53 degrees, he said. Your granddaddy was right. He was right. And you built it. You finished what he started. I looked up at him. This old man with his one clouded eye and his hands white with lime, and his son buried under a quarry blast. This man who had come out of nowhere because he saw my smoke and remembered a friend who never finished anything. We built it, I said. He nodded slowly. Then he sat down beside me on the corridor floor, and we sat there together in the mountain's breath, and for the first time since I had arrived at Mercy Gap, I felt like I might not die here. But I hadn't found the water yet. And the real test, the winter that would prove whether this corridor could do what Silas had dreamed, was still 2 years away. That first winter was a rehearsal. I didn't know it then, but I was learning. Jonah came most days, though the walk got harder for him as the cold deepened. His cough got worse. His hand shook when he held the level, but he kept coming, and together we refined the system. The baffle's the key, he told me one morning. We were adjusting the vent in the middle of the corridor, a sliding panel that controlled how much cave air could mix with cabin air. Too much flow and you cool the cabin down instead of warming it. Too little and you don't get the benefit. You've got to find the balance. I learned to read the corridor the way a sailor reads wind. I could feel when the outside temperature dropped by the way the cave air moved faster through the passage. I could tell when a storm was coming by the subtle shift in pressure that made the baffle creak. The mountain was talking. I just had to learn its language. Jonah taught me other things too. How to bank a fire so it would last through the night without burning through all my wood. How to seal the cabin's remaining gaps with a mixture of clay and horsehair that would flex without cracking. How to read the sky for weather and the trees for wind direction. But he also taught me things that weren't about building. One afternoon, while we were mixing mortar, he told me about his wife. Her name was Della. She had made the best apple butter in the county, and she had laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, and when she died he had considered walking into the quarry pit and not walking out. "What stopped you?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I realized that dying was easy. Living was the hard thing, and I'd spent my whole life doing hard things." He spread mortar on a seam with his trowel, smooth and even. Seemed like a waste to quit at the end. That winter I used less than half the wood I should have needed. The corridor wasn't magic. The cabin still got cold, especially at night, especially when the wind blew hard from the north. But it never got killing cold. It never got so cold that I had to choose between freezing and burning through my whole woodpile in a week. The system worked. But only Jonah and I knew it. And Jonah was getting weaker. Spring came late that year. The snow didn't melt until mid-March, and the mud lasted until May. But when the ground finally thawed, I started the work that Silas had never gotten to, the expansion. The corridor was 20 feet long, but Silas's journals talked about something bigger. A whole system of connected spaces, using the cave's deep chambers for storage, using the bluff's thermal mass for more than just buffering the cabin. He had dreamed of growing things underground, of keeping food through the winter without salt or smoke, of turning the worthless limestone hollow into something that could sustain a life. I didn't have the lumber or the skill for all of that, but I could make the corridor better. I could widen it. I could add a small alcove on the cave side for storage. I could make the doors seal tighter and the baffle work smoother. The work took all spring and most of summer. My hands, which had blistered and bled that first winter, grew calluses so thick I could grip a saw without feeling it. My shoulders, which had screamed after every day of hauling boards, grew strong enough to carry 2 at once. I didn't look like a girl anymore. I looked like a person who worked. Jonah helped when he could, but his cough was getting worse. Some days he came and just sat on the stone footings, watching me work, offering advice when I asked for it. Other days he didn't come at all. "You should see a doctor," I told him one afternoon. "Doctors cost money, and they'll just tell me what I already know." He coughed into his handkerchief, and when he pulled it away, there was a spot of red. He saw me looking and folded the cloth quickly. "The quarry dust. Gets in your lungs and stays there. 30 years of breathing stone. The stone eventually wins." By summer's end, the corridor was 5 feet wide instead of 4. I had built a small storage alcove just inside the cave mouth, where the temperature stayed cool even in August. Potatoes I stored there in July were still firm in September. Onions lasted through October. The cave was keeping my food the way it kept its air. Steady, patient, indifferent to the seasons raging outside. I started selling the surplus. The first time I brought vegetables to Mercy Crossing, Martha Pell looked at me like I had grown a second head. "These came from your place?" "From the cave." "From the cave." She picked up a potato, turned it over in her hands. It was smooth and clean, no eyes sprouting, no soft spots. "It's September. These look like they were dug last week." "They were dug in July." She stared at me. I could see her trying to work out how I was lying, what the trick was. People in Mercy Crossing knew that vegetables dug in July went soft or sprouted or rotted by September. That was just how things were. "I'll give you 2 cents each for the potatoes," she said finally. 5 cents for the onions." It wasn't charity. It wasn't even kindness. It was just business. And business Martha Pell understood. I took her money and walked back to the hollow with coins in my pocket for the first time since I had arrived. Word spread. That's how small towns work. By October, people started coming to me instead of waiting for me to come to them. Asa Klein came first. He was a widower with 3 children and a farm that was always one bad season from failing. He stood in my yard, hat in his hands, and asked if it was true that I could keep vegetables fresh through the winter. "It's true." "How?" "The cave. The temperature stays the same year-round. Food doesn't rot as fast in cool, steady air." He looked at the corridor, at the bluff, at the black mouth of the cave beyond. I could see the suspicion in his face. The same suspicion I saw in everyone's face. But behind it was something else. Desperation. The desperate hope that maybe the crazy Wren girl had found something that actually worked. "I've got more turnips than I can eat," he said. "Lost half of them last year to rot. If you could store some through the winter, bring them by." We'll split whatever survives." He came back 3 days later with a wagon full of turnips. By November, I had vegetables stored for half a dozen families, all of them paying me in shares or trade goods or the occasional coin. The cave was becoming a business. The worthless inheritance was becoming something else entirely. But not everyone was happy about it. Calvin Reddick owned the woodyard in Mercy Crossing. He also owned part of the wagon works and held notes on half the farms in the valley. When people needed credit to get through a hard winter, they went to Calvin Reddick. When they couldn't pay, Calvin Reddick took their land. He came to my cabin on a cold afternoon in November, riding a gray horse and wearing a coat that cost more than everything I owned combined. "Miss Wren." He didn't dismount. He just sat there on his horse looking down at me, at the corridor, at the cave mouth beyond. "I've been hearing stories." "Stories?" "People say you've got some kind of root cellar that keeps food fresh all winter. People say you're burning half the wood everyone else burns and staying just as warm." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say your granddaddy wasn't as crazy as everyone thought." "My grandfather was exactly as sane as everyone thought. They just thought wrong." His smile flickered. "I came to make you an offer, $12 for the tract. That's $3 more than Silas paid for it and more than anyone else will give you. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Miss Wren. It's just a question of price." He leaned forward in his saddle. "This place isn't farmland. It isn't timber. It's a hole in a cliff and a cabin that's one bad storm from falling down. Take the $12. Go somewhere with a future." I looked up at him. This man on his gray horse with his expensive coat. This man who made his living off other people's desperation. "Mr. Reddick," I said. "The last person who told me I had no future was Mrs. Hester Vale of the Monroe Female Relief House. She said my grandfather left me a box of wind in a house built against a grave." I gestured at the corridor, at the cave, at the bluff that rose behind it all. "This is what that box of wind looks like, and I'm not selling it to you or anyone else." His face went hard. "Winter's coming, Miss Wren. Real winter. Not the gentle kind we had last year. When that cabin breaks and you're freezing in the dark, you'll wish you'd taken my $12. "Maybe, but I'll wish it from here, not from wherever $12 would have bought me a bed for a month." He turned his horse and rode away without another word. But I knew he'd be back. Men like Calvin Reddick always came back. They could wait. They had time and money, and people like me usually ran out of both. The winter of 1897 was harder than the one before. The cold came earlier and stayed later. Snow piled up against the cabin walls and drifted across the corridor entrance until I had to dig my way out each morning. But the system held. The corridor kept the cabin's air from plunging to killing temperatures. The cave kept my stored food fresh and my water from freezing. I burned wood, yes, but not much. A basket of kindling most days, enough to take the edge off and heat my cooking. Families who had laughed at Silas Wren's rock garden were hauling wood every week just to stay alive. I was hauling it every few days, and I was staying comfortable. By February, people started coming to see. They came quietly at first, in ones and twos. Asa Klein brought his neighbor, Tom Harless. Tom Harless told his brother, who told his cousin, who told someone at church. By the end of the month, I had visitors almost every week. They stood in the corridor and felt the air moving past them, warmer than outside, steadier than any stove could make it. They touched the walls and felt the cold, but not killing cold. They looked at me with something new in their eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the beginning of it. In March, Professor Nathaniel Quarles came from Lewisburg. He was a science teacher at the academy there, a thin man with spectacles and a notebook and the manner of someone who had spent his life trying to explain things to people who didn't want explanations. He had heard about the Wren girls' cave house from a colleague whose cousin lived in Mercy Crossing. He had traveled 30 miles on bad roads to see if the stories were true. I showed him everything, the corridor, the storage alcove, the baffle vent. I let him read Silas's journals, the ones with the temperature measurements and the smoke tests and the airflow diagrams. He spent 3 days measuring, noting, sketching, asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. On the fourth day, he sat on the stone footings and looked at the whole system with something like wonder on his face. "This is remarkable," he said. "Your grandfather understood thermal mass and convective airflow better than engineers I've met. The principle is sound. The execution is elegant." He shook his head slowly. "Why does no one know about this except the woman who nearly froze before anyone listened?" "Because my grandfather was poor and strange and lived in a hollow that nobody visited, because people would rather believe someone is crazy than admit they might have been wrong." Professor Quarles nodded. "I'd like to write a circular about this, a pamphlet explaining the principles, crediting your grandfather as the originator and you as the builder who proved it works." "Why?" He looked at me over his spectacles. "Because there are other hollows, Miss Wren. Other families living in cabins pressed against limestone bluffs. Other people who might survive a hard winter if they knew what you know." He smiled. "And because I'm a teacher. Teaching things is what I do." I said yes. What else was I going to say? By spring, Professor Quarles' circular was being read in 3 counties. By summer, I had visitors from as far as Lewisburg and Hinton, people who wanted to see the cave house, people who wanted to understand how it worked. That autumn, the wells all ran full. The woodpiles all looked tall. The harvest came in thick and heavy. Nobody in Mercy Crossing had any idea what kind of month was coming. The warning came on February 2nd, 1899. A trapper named Owen Sipes stopped at my door just before dusk. He was half frozen, his beard stiff with ice, his eyes wild with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it. "Drum, there's weather coming," he said. "Blue northern sky. Pressure dropping like a stone. I've been trapping these mountains for 30 years and I've never felt the air go this wrong this fast." He looked at my cabin, at the corridor, at the cave mouth beyond. "You're the Wren girl, the one with the cave house." "I am." "Then you might be all right. Everyone else—" He shook his head. "Everyone else better pray they've got enough wood to burn for a month." He left before I could offer him food or shelter. He had miles to go before dark, he said, people to warn, but his words stayed with me through the night. Blue northern sky, pressure dropping like a stone, a month. The next morning I tore down what was left of the old porch. I had been meaning to rebuild it, to make a proper entrance to the cabin instead of the bare doorframe that led directly into the corridor. But now I needed those boards for something else. I needed to finish the outer section of the corridor, the part that connected the cave side door to a proper exterior entrance, the part I had been planning to build next spring. I didn't have until next spring. I had hours. Jonah came at noon. He was weaker than I had ever seen him, walking with a stick now, stopping every few steps to catch his breath. But he came. "Heard about the weather," he said. "Thought you might need help." "I need to finish the outer section, the part by the cave mouth." "Then we better start." We worked through the day and into the night. By lantern light, we nailed boards and stuffed gaps and sealed seams with every scrap of mortar we had left. My hands bled. Jonah's cough got so bad he had to sit for 10 minutes between each task, but we kept working. By dawn, the outer section was done. Not pretty, not as tight as the rest of the corridor, but done. The system was complete. A sealed passage from cabin to cave with double doors and baffles at both ends. The mountain's breath connected to my living space in a way that Silas had dreamed about for 30 years. The storm arrived that afternoon. I have lived through hard winters. I have seen cold that killed livestock and snow that buried houses to their eaves. But I have never, before or since, seen anything like the February of 1899. The wind came first. It came from the north like something that had been waiting. It hit the hollow with a sound like the whole world screaming. The temperature, which had been cold but normal that morning, dropped 30 degrees in 3 hours. By nightfall, it was below zero. By midnight, it was 20 below. By the next morning, the thermometer I had hung outside the cabin had frozen solid and I couldn't read it anymore. But I didn't need to read it. I could feel it. The cold was a physical thing. It pressed against the walls. It seeped through every crack I hadn't sealed. It found gaps I didn't know existed. But inside the cabin, connected to the corridor, connected to the cave, the temperature held. 44 degrees. Not warm, not comfortable, but livable. The kind of cold that makes you wear a coat indoors and sleep under every blanket you own. Not the kind of cold that kills you. I kept a fire burning in the stove, small, just enough to take the worst edge off. I used maybe a double handful of kindling each day. The cave did the rest. The mountain did the rest. That steady breath of 50-degree air flowing through the corridor, mixing with the cabin air, keeping the temperature from plunging into the depths where flesh freezes and blood stops moving. Outside, the world was dying. The Pells burned through half their woodpile in 9 days. Asa Klein lost 2 pigs and nearly lost his youngest boy, who wandered too far from the stove and couldn't feel his fingers by the time they found him. The relief house in Union, Mrs. Vale's relief house, had ice forming on the inside of the dormitory windows, and Calvin Reddick's customers bought him nearly bare. Every stick of seasoned wood he had, every log he could split. By the 3rd week, people were burning green wood because there wasn't anything else. Green wood that smoked and sputtered and put out half the heat of dry. Green wood that couldn't keep up with the cold pouring through their walls. I heard about it in pieces, people stopping by to see if the cave house was still standing, people asking if I had room, people who had mocked Silas Wren and called his granddaughter foolish now standing in my yard with their breath freezing in front of their faces, asking if the stories were true. The stories were true. On the 18th day, the worst night came. The wind shifted. It had been steady from the north, brutal but predictable. Now it swirled. It found the seams in my corridor's outer section, the section we had built in one desperate night. I heard whistling. I felt cold air streaming through. I crawled into the corridor with a hammer and a scarf over my mouth. Jonah was there. He had been staying with me for a week by then, too weak to make the walk back to his cabin every day. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold a nail, but he held them, and I hammered them. And together, in the howling dark, we sealed the seam that was trying to kill us. When we crawled back into the cabin, I looked at the thermometer on the wall. 41 degrees. The system had held. Martha Pell came first. She arrived on the 20th day, carrying her youngest wrapped in every quilt she owned. Her face was gaunt. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't meet my eyes. "My husband's too proud to come," she said, "but my boy can't stop shivering. Please." I opened the door wider. "Bring him in." I didn't make her beg. I didn't remind her of what she had said at the mercantile. That day she told me I couldn't live off a hole in the cliff. I didn't mention the ungodly cold and the ungodly warm and the way she had made the word ungodly sound like a curse. I just said yes. She came back the next day with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of the week, my cabin was full. People sleeping in the corridor. Children huddled in the storage alcove. Bodies pressed together for warmth that they didn't need as badly as they thought, because the cave was breathing and the mountain was holding, and the system was doing exactly what Silas Wren had designed it to do. I gave space to the Kleins, who had been kind to me when kindness was rare. I gave space to June Harless and her 2 daughters, who had never been anything but polite. I gave space to the Bickles, who had sent me away years ago for reading by lantern light. They didn't recognize me at first. When they did, they couldn't look at me. "You're the girl we had," Mrs. Bickle said, "the one who read too much." "I'm the girl you sent away," I said. And yes, I still read too much. That's why this place works. I gave space to everyone who came. I turned no one away. The corridor filled. The cabin filled. The storage alcove filled. And still the system held. 55 degrees from the cave, 44 degrees in the cabin, livable, survivable, a small pocket of mercy in a month that had none anywhere else. Jonah watched it all from his chair by the stove, too weak now to do much more than watch. One evening, when the cabin was full of sleeping families and the corridor was packed with people who had laughed at my grandfather, he caught my eye and shook his head slowly. "They don't deserve it, you know. Most of them." "Maybe not." I was making soup, stretching the last of my stored vegetables to feed as many mouths as I could. But cold doesn't care who was cruel, and I decided I wouldn't be colder than the weather. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your granddaddy would have been proud of you." I didn't answer. My eyes were stinging, and I told myself it was the smoke from the stove. On the 27th day, Hester Vale came. I didn't recognize her at first. She was bundled in so many layers she could barely walk. Her steel gray bun was hidden under a wool cap. Her face, which I remembered as sharp and certain, looked old and afraid. She came with two girls from the relief house, girls I didn't know. Girls who had replaced me in the dormitory after I left. "Miss Wren." Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "I came to ask for shelter. For the girls. Come in." She stepped inside, into the crowded warmth, into the cave breath, and the body heat, and the smell of too many people living too close together. She looked around at the corridor, at the bluff face visible through the gaps, at the system that Silas had dreamed and I had built. "It works," she said, as if the evidence of her own eyes wasn't enough. "It works. Your grandfather—" She stopped, swallowed, started again. "Your grandfather wrote to me after your mother died. He wanted me to send you to him." I had known this. Jonah had told me. But hearing it from her mouth was different. "He sent money," she continued, $10 for rail and wagon fare. She closed her eyes. "I thought this place was unfit. I thought he was unsound. I kept the letter. I deposited the money in the house account. I never told you." I didn't say anything. The cabin was very quiet. Every family who had come to me for shelter was watching. Every person who had once laughed at the Wren girl was listening. I was wrong. Mrs. Vale opened her eyes. They were wet. "I thought I was protecting you from a mad old man. I see now that I was protecting myself from looking foolish." She reached into her coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope. The paper was soft with age. The ink faded, but I could still read the address. "To Miss Eliza Wren, care of the Monroe Female Relief House." "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I kept you from him. I'm sorry he died alone." I took the letter. I didn't open it. I already knew what it said. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you chose well, because I will not let your choice become the shape of my life." She nodded. Tears ran down her face. She didn't wipe them away. "The girls can stay," I said. "You can stay too, if you need to. There's room." There wasn't room. There was barely space to breathe, but I made room. Because cold doesn't care who was cruel, and I was never going to be colder than the weather. The month ended. The cold broke. February became March, and March became mud, and gradually, slowly, the world outside stopped trying to kill everyone in it. The families left my cabin one by one. Some thanked me. Some couldn't look me in the eye. Some pressed coins or food or tools into my hands, payment for a debt they knew they could never fully repay. Calvin Reddick's sister came with a bolt of cloth and an apology her brother was too proud to deliver himself. Professor Quarles returned in April. He measured everything again. He wrote a longer circular this time, calling Silas Wren a pioneer of earth-sheltered habitation, and me the builder who proved his theories under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He talked about thermal mass and convective exchange and limestone climate buffering. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. My grandfather's name was in print. My grandfather's work was recognized. The man who had spent 30 years measuring drafts and dreaming of winter throats was finally being called something other than crazy. Within 3 winters, 6 families in limestone hollows had built their own versions of the corridor. Within 5 years, the number was 20. Within 10, Professor Quarles told me that earth-sheltered housing was being discussed in university lectures as far away as Pennsylvania. Silas Wren never lived to see any of it. But I lived. And I made sure the world knew his name. Jonah Beale died in the autumn of 1908. I found him in his chair on my porch, a bowl of bean soup still warm on the table beside him. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had finished his work and was resting. His hands, white with lime, were folded in his lap. I buried him on the ridge above the bluff, where the morning sun strikes first. I planted mountain thyme on his grave and pressed his trowel into the soil handle first, because he had always said a stonemason should be buried with his tools. He left me his cabin, his mule, and his kiln shed. He left me a letter that said only, "You were the daughter I should have had." Build something. I married Thomas Harless in 1904. He was a widower, a carpenter, and the first man who studied my corridor before he studied my face. He understood why I loved the work. He never asked me to give it up. We had 2 children. I trained apprentices, young men and women, who came to learn the principles that Silas had discovered, and I had proven. I wrote letters to engineers and professors. I gave tours to visitors from universities I had never heard of. I grew old in the hollow that everyone had told me was worthless. By the time I couldn't climb the bluff anymore, my hands knew the cave the way a pianist knows a keyboard. Every seam, every joint, every change in airflow. I could tell the weather by the way the corridor breathed. I could feel seasons shifting in the temperature of the walls. My children thought I was strange. My grandchildren thought I was a character. But the hollow was still there. The cave was still there. The corridor was still there, rebuilt and expanded and copied across half the county. Proof that a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a carpetbag of stolen books had seen something that everyone else had missed. My children thought I was strange. My grandchildren thought I was a character. But the hollow was still there. The cave was still there. The corridor was still there, rebuilt and expanded and copied across half the county. Proof that a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a carpetbag of stolen books had seen something that everyone else had missed. I died on a Tuesday in the spring of 1947. I was found sitting just inside the corridor door, my hand on the latch, as if I had been checking the weather one last time. My daughter said I looked like I had simply paused between tasks. She said I looked peaceful. She said I looked like a woman who had finished her work. The cave still breathes. The corridor still holds. The families who learned from me and from Silas still use the principles he discovered in 1867. The stone still remembers the temperature of other seasons. The mountain still keeps steady what the surface cannot. Mrs. Vale called it a box of wind and a house built against a grave. She was right about both. It was a box of wind. The wind just happened to be exactly what we needed. And it was built against a grave. The grave of everything I had been told I was worth. Every placement that failed. Every family that sent me back. Every voice that said a girl who read too much would never amount to anything. On the wall of my cabin, in a frame my husband built, there's a page from Silas Wren's 14th journal. The handwriting is faded now. The paper is yellowed, but the words are still clear. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. I learned how to ask, and the mountain answered. And I'm asking you now, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever box of wind you've been laughed out of opening, what cave have you been standing outside of? What worthless inheritance have you been told to walk away from? What strange, dismissed, ungainly thing have you been afraid to claim because everyone around you said it was nothing? I was 16 when I walked into Mercy Gap with a carpet bag and $1.32. I had no skills, no family, no future anyone could see. I had been placed and replaced and returned like damaged goods. The only thing I had was a dead man's journals and the stubbornness to read them. And the thing everyone told me was worthless, the box of wind, the house against the grave, the rock and the cave and the hollow that couldn't be plowed. That worthless thing saved my life. It saved dozens of lives. It changed how people in 3 counties thought about winter and stone and survival. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land and of any human being. What matters is what lies underneath. What matters is whether you're willing to dig. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves and rusted keys, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. Your mountain may look like rock to everyone else. Learn how to ask it.